What is up, guys, and welcome to today's video. In today's video, I'm going to be going over and trying to summarize a book, Man, Economy, and the State, written by Murray and Rothbard, an Austrian economist. So without further ado, let's get into it. In a study of economics, Rothbard starts at praxeology, that is the study of human action. He realizes that fundamentally, the economy is just a bunch of individual humans acting. And so he deduces that humans are individuals who act with purposeful actions. That is, there is an uncertain future, and we come up with actions that we think will best improve the future, whether that's to remove our uneasiness about the future state of conditions or to better our satisfaction in the future. There are subjective valuations that we come up with, and we attach scarce resources as means to the ends of these subjective valuations. Now, an individual creates ordinal values, meaning he has an ordered list, a subjective mental ordered list of what he values. And based on the units of a given resource he receives, he'll decide how to allocate that resources to satisfy his desired ends. And so out of this comes the law of marginal utility. And what that essentially means is that the individual satisfies his most desired end first with a given unit he receives. So for example, if an individual receives $1 and the first thing he buys with that dollar is subjectively the most valued thing for him. Now if an individual receives $10 more and buys 10 more things, those 10 things are subjectively of less utility to him because he decides to buy them after the fact. And so each extra unit of money in this sense that is added to the individual provides less mental satisfaction than the other ones, because the first unit he receives goes to satisfy the most subjectively most valued end, whereas the other units he receives all have to satisfy subjectively less valued ends. And in the flip side of that, if an individual was to take away a unit of a given resource, such as money, the end that the individual stops satisfying would be the least valued end that is currently being satisfied. So for example, if I had $10 and someone took $1 from me, and now I don't buy a pack of gum, my actions, based on praxeology deals with actions because that's fundamentally all we can see. My actions showcase that out of all of my ordinal desires that I've satisfied so far, gum was the least valued of those desired. And so each unit of resources we get will go in satisfying a desire that is less valued than the desires already satisfied by those resources. After analyzing human action, Rothbard goes on to exchanges. And so we will start with direct exchange, which can also be thought of as barter. For example, maybe back in grade school, you would have some snacks. For example, we could think gummy bears, and you'd exchange these gummy bears for another kid's snacks, maybe pretzels. And so this exchange is known as barter. And out of this must come a voluntary exchange. That is, in the free market, exchanges are only done based on voluntary cooperation. They must result in mutual benefit, and they must occur because of a reverse subjective valuation. That is, when you decide to exchange your gummy bears for another kid's pretzels, there's a mutual benefit. You would only receive the pretzels in exchange for the gummy bears if you valued the pretzels more than the gummy bears. And the other individual would only receive the gummy bears in exchange for the pretzels if they valued the gummy bears more than the pretzels. And so because of this reverse subjective valuation, there's an opportunity for an exchange to occur. And this exchange results in a net improvement of life quality, as we just saw, as both individuals end up getting something that they desire more than what they currently have. And so this specialization in division of labor can be taken to an extreme, where an individual specializes at producing one given thing and then gets really good at it and decides to exchange with everyone else. And by getting really good at producing one specific thing and exchanging this given thing, an individual is able to improve his quality of life significantly, as well as everyone else's quality of life. Now, there are a few limitations with direct exchange, that is barter. The first is the double coincidence of wants. So in order for this transaction to occur, both individuals have to desire what the other individuals have. If you had gummy bears, but your friend had pretzels, but he didn't want your gummy bears. He wanted milk. You're out of luck. Good luck getting the pretzels, right? And so because of this, there needs to be a double coincidence of wants for an exchange to occur, as well as the lack of divisibility. If you want, let's say you build homes, for example, and you're trying to create an exchange with an individual that manufactures gummy bears. A home, most people would deem as significantly more valuable than a pack of gummy bears. So the question comes about, how many gummy bears are you going to receive for the home? And so, because you can't give a portion of the home, or they wouldn't most likely want that, there comes this problem of, well, we can't really divide this good in half. And so you'd have to receive an inordinately high amount of this other good. So this lack of divisibility is a big problem, as well as the ease of transport. It can be quite a pain to transport big items long distances. Like example, if you traded homes, like how the heck are you supposed to transport a home across the sea? It's going to be very difficult. As well as there's no common denominator to compare, there's no ratio to compare things with. And there's no price, so everything is just subjectively based on barter, but that makes things difficult in the long term. Oops, the camera's over there. We go. That makes things difficult in a specialized society when you may want to exchange with a lot of other individuals, and there's no way to measure your productivity, objectively speaking. And so the common denominator to compare things with, the ease of transport, the lack of divisibility, and the double coincidence of wants all leads society to a tendency to develop indirect exchange. And that's where money comes about. So out of direct exchange, people realize, well, there's probably a better way for us to go about interacting in society instead of just bartering around. And so instead, people come up with indirect exchange. And so people would traditionally trade things such as seashells, gold, metals, whatever people would find, people would trade as a medium of exchange. And so fundamentally, what we call money is a medium of exchange. That is, instead of having the direct exchange between gummy bears and pretzels, you exchange the gummy bears for money, and then you can exchange that money for pretzels. And so because we have this medium in between our exchange, this medium of exchange allows us to get rid of those problems we were facing with direct exchange. And so a key characteristic of money is that it is exchanged, not consumed. So most goods in the market are there to be consumed and give humans some sort of subjective satisfaction based on the consumption of the good. However, with money, it's not to be consumed most of the time. I mean, very rarely, maybe in hyperinflation, you may consume it by burning it to increase your heat or something like that, but typically money is for exchange. And so out of this also comes laws of supply and demand. And so we have an upward sloping supply curve as well as a downward sloping demand curve. And that's because as the price of a given good increases, the individual desires a quantity that's less because they have to give up more to purchase that same good. As well as when the price decreases, the individual can desire more of the good as he gives up less on his subjective value, ordinal valuations to receive that good. As well on the flip side, the producers will give up more and to produce more when the price they can receive for that good is higher. When the price is very low, the producers aren't willing to produce much as they're not going to get rewarded much, and so they're more reluctant to put more into the production. And so we had these sort of these two graphs right here, and they intersect right here at what we call the equilibrium. And that's where supply and demand are perfectly in sync. Now that never really occurs, if not briefly for a moment in the free markets, but constantly society is tending towards the point of equilibrium. After that, Rothbard decides to dive into production. And so what he refers to are the stages of production. And that's essentially how individuals are able to turn land and labor and capital into consumer goods. Now capital are just goods that have had prior labor done to land. and turned into capital goods. And so he has this structure of higher lower order to lower order goods. Higher order goods are the ones further away from human consumption, such as like the random metal that's going to be used as part of your car, and the lowest order goods are the things that you consume, such as the apples you buy at the grocery store or the PlayStation you may buy at the game store or whatnot. And so in order to gauge production and in order to guide the entrepreneur, there's this thing called time preference. Now, time preference is an essential reality of the market, and that is the fact that individuals value what they can have currently more than the same thing that they could have in the future. So that is, if you were to offer an individual an apple now versus an apple in the future, most individuals would take an apple now because that's more valued than in the future, because there's uncertainty in the future. I mean, for all they know, they could die tomorrow or something else could happen. And this uncertainty breeds time preference, where people naturally have a tendency to desire the thing now over some time in the future. And so out of this time preference comes savings, where people say, well, I can set aside some of my current consumption in the hopes of consuming more later on. The key thing is they'd have to get the opportunity to consume more in the future in order for it to be worthwhile to them. And so that's where interest rates come in, where an individual may borrow money from the savers and pay them interest on the money they're borrowing. And this works in two ways and ties together with the entrepreneurship. But because this directly shows that when you have an increase in savings, there is going to be a lower interest rate, as there's going to be more money in the market for entrepreneurs to borrow from. Because that supply of money is increased, the interest rate's going to have been lowered. Whereas if there's less saving and more consumption, the cost of it, that's considered low time preference, the cost of borrowing money is going to be extremely high, and that's going to be represented in high interest rates. And so, and just like any other thing, the laws of supply and demand determine price determination on all the goods, and the price determination of goods are determined solely based on the consumer's subjective valuations. As we saw last time, the subjective valuations are what truly matter. It's not the price of production that determines the cost of the good. All the consumer sees is the final good, and he compares that final good and subjectively values it on his ordinal value scale. And depending on how he values it, that determines how much he's willing to pay. He could care less with regards to the production process and its cost that went into it. Now, if an entrepreneur wanted to compete in the industry, that may be different, but solely from a consumer perspective, they don't care about the production costs. They just care about the good they're going to receive, and so that determines the price. Now, entrepreneurs play a key role in the market economy. They're the individuals that bear the uncertainty through profit and loss. So an entrepreneur has to try to predict what it is that humans value and what they will subjectively value. And this is the whole game with entrepreneurship, is that we can't really fully know. We can't predict the future. There's uncertainty in the future. And so the entrepreneur bears this uncertainty, and he'll take money or borrow money from savers and pay them interest and hope to pay them back with more after having successful ventures, where he'll receive profits and be rewarded if he accurately predicts the desires of the consumers. Whereas if he fails at predicting the consumer's subjective desires, he's going to receive losses. And so in this beautiful way, the market is able to reward individuals who are able to improve the life quality of everyone else. The entrepreneur that succeeds builds successful businesses that other people value. And in valuing those businesses, they're willing to pay for those products, and he's able to reap profits and obtain more capital and continue the same process. Whereas if the entrepreneur fails and misallocates resources, and this malinvestment causes a loss on the entrepreneur's part, and now it's going to be significantly harder for the entrepreneur to raise more capital to start new ventures. And so in this way, the market rewards individuals and punishes individuals. Now, a key point to the market economy is competition. If an individual at any point thinks he can better satisfy other individuals' desires, he is free to compete on the market. He can become an entrepreneur and start his own business and compete and see if he can better satisfy humans' desires. And if he can, he'll be rewarded with profits, and he'll be able to continue this process, making more and more money. Now, that is a key point that forces entrepreneurs to bend to the demands of consumers. If the entrepreneur refuses to produce what the consumers desire, in a free market, they will lose money. And so competition is key. Point, Rothbard was talking about the free market. At the end of his book, he takes a shift towards analyzing market intervention and the government. Now, he analyzes the effects of taxation, price controls, and government expenditures. Fundamentally, he realizes that they all affect the free market and the prosperity of individuals. He highlights the reward misalignment. He realizes that on the free market, as we had previously seen, the entrepreneur was rewarded based on their ability to satisfy human desires, subjective valuations. But with the government, the individual is not rewarded based on his ability to satisfy his fellow citizens' desires. Instead, he is rewarded by his ability to take money from other individuals, as there are no such things as profit and losses. Can't lose some focus there. There are no such thing as profit and losses with the government, as the government doesn't produce and is also able to essentially infinitely tax and print money. So the whole profit and loss notion, he deems, is out the window. And because of this reward misalignment, there leads to inefficiencies, as the government doesn't have to be efficient, as it doesn't have to make a profit in order to survive, like business, as well as he deems the government as a monopoly. And because of that, there's a lack of competition, leading to inefficiencies in the market. He also analyzes how price controls pretty much hurt everyone at play, as how we previously saw that exchanges are mutually beneficial. If an exchange is mutually beneficial and someone decides to put a price control that is preventing an exchange that would have occurred in another situation, that then ends up hurting the individuals who would have benefited from those exchanges. Camera keeps losing focus for some reason. Now, as well as government expenditures, those also misallocate resources. So he analyzes these things, and then he also analyzes how taxation, he deems, is fundamentally based on coercion. If you don't pay your taxes, the government then uses violence to seize your assets. And fundamentally, if you just try to protect yourself and your assets, the government will use more force and violence. And he shows a contrast between coercion and voluntarism. And coercion being government intervention in the market versus voluntarism being the voluntary free trade of the free market. And so he highlights how with voluntary free trade, individuals both benefit from the transaction. Whereas with coercion, if an individual didn't freely decide to give the government their money in exchange for its services, well, then there's no way to say that the individual truly does benefit. If he benefited, he would have done so freely. But the very fact that the government has to use coercion in order to take people's money via taxation shows that those individuals that have to give up their money don't actually end up benefiting, because there are other things they would have rather spent that money on. So he analyzes this and sets a framework for why he believes the government shouldn't be interfering in the market. So after analyzing the government intervention on the market, Rothbard then turns to explain inflation and the business cycle. And so Rothbard starts by giving an overview of central banks. So these can be thought of as government-backed big banks, such as the Federal Reserve Bank. And so he pretty much says that the Federal Reserve Bank is, although it's under a pseudo-private public bank, it's really just a government bank with under complete government control. And so he then talks about inflation, as inflation is issuing money beyond the stock of the commodity. And so an example of this would be if the banks issue too many paper notes when the dollar is supposed to be backed by gold, and they don't increase the stock of the gold, then that increased supply of money will lead to a general rise in prices, which we call inflation. And then he goes on to explain the business cycle, which is the booms and the busts, as a result of credit expansion. And so what he deems is that central banks allow for excess credit expansion. Central banks control the interest rates artificially. And so what they do is they back all these other banks as a lender of last resort. And because of this, these banks don't have to worry about getting bank runs or having to pay back or to having to give out all this cash that people have stored. So they're able to lend a bunch of money because they know, well, worst case scenario, the central bank has my back. And so what this ends up happening is this artificial credit expansion leads to a low interest rate, lowers the interest rate. And so a lot of the times governments will think, well, we want to stimulate the economy. And they call it like the classic Keynesian economics. Stimulate the economy, will lower the interest rates, and businesses will be able to borrow at cheap prices, and we'll have all this business prosperity that we otherwise wouldn't have had. And so they'll do that. They artificially lower the interest rates, and malinvestment occurs. And so what happens is, as we talked about previously, the interest rate is specifically tied to time preference. That is, if individuals have a low time preference, they don't care, they're not too dependent on spending the money immediately, then the interest rate might be a little bit lower, as they're okay. They have to receive less in return for withholding the use of their consumption. But if the time preference is extremely high, individuals want to spend their money immediately. And so they're going to have to receive a higher interest on the money they decide to save. And so because of this, saving and interest rates are saving, which is directly tied to time preference, is directly tied to the interest rate as well. But with the credit expansion artificially through the central bank, they're able to artificially lower this interest rate. And so because of that, malinvestment occurs because businesses use this artificially low interest rate and they calculate business profitability and they think, well, we could engage in this long business venture because we have this low interest rate that we could use to fund our project. And so they'll engage in this business venture that might have only actually worked if individuals truly had the lower time preference. But because this was artificially lowered and the individual time preference is actually higher than what's being represented, eventually this is considered a malinvestment. And so then what happens is, through this artificially low interest rate and credit expansion, inflation starts to occur. And the central banks realize this as more money keeps entering circulation and through the excess credit. And then what happens is they decide, well, the inflation is getting out of control. We don't want our currency to engage in hyperinflation, where prices just rise extremely quickly. And so they decide we have to raise the interest rate. And so the Federal Reserve may raise the interest rate. But then when they raise the interest rate, and this interest rate is returning to somewhere around the actual time preference of the consumers, all of these projects that relied on this lower interest rate in order to function and finance their projects all have to go boom. And so this malinvestment is then realized, and this is a correctional phase that then must occur due to the malinvestments. Even if it doesn't occur immediately, somewhere down the line, if inflation isn't going to get out of control, this correction must occur. And so through this correction, the businesses then have to adjust. And most of them end up going bankrupt because they can't finance these projects they've engaged on with this now higher interest rate. And another key point is that inflation is fundamentally a redistribution of wealth as well. Because what ends up happening is when new money enters the supply, that originally when that the first dollar enters the supply, the individual with that dollar can purchase any good they desire with the purchasing power of the current money. But eventually what happens is those dollars slowly enter the economy. The individuals who are last to spend their money end up spending money with a currency that has been deflated, as now there's more money in circulation. And so just like any other good, laws of supply and demand occur. And so if there's a larger supply of money, the purchasing power of that given money is now lowered, and so your money's going to be able to buy less goods. And so it's a bit of an overview between the inflation, the business cycle, and how it's all tied together. And so fundamentally, the Austrian business cycle, and specifically Rothbard's explanation of it, relies on the fact that artificial credit expansion from the banks leads to artificially low interest rates, which lead to malinvestment and what we see as the boom, and then you get the bust, the correction after the fact, when the central banks have to raise the interest rates to try to keep inflation under control. So in summary, Rothbard then compares the free market with the interventionist market of the government. And he analyzes how on the free market, every exchange must be of mutual benefit. Every exchange occurs because of reverse subjective valuations, where the individual thinks they are going to be better off after engaging in the exchange. And both individuals think so, and that is where they both decide to engage in this voluntary exchange, which leads to an improvement in both of their life qualities. Also, he analyzes how the free market leads to efficiencies via competition. When a bunch of free markets in the free market, when a bunch of businesses are competing, trying to best satisfy the consumer desires, those that are able to succeed. And the consumer directly chooses which ones succeed and which ones don't. And the consumer is also able to pivot to support another business if they find that business can better satisfy their desires. And so this competition ensures that these businesses have to perform efficiently, or else they're going to go bankrupt. And then at the same time, he analyzes the interventionist government market, and he analyzes how some live at the expense of others. In the coerced transactions that occur, the very fact that they are coerced showcases that the individual getting forced to do whatever that thing may be wouldn't have otherwise done it, and that's why force is necessary. And so in that regard, that individual is worse off than they could have been if they weren't forced to do that. Now, some do live at the expense of others because the individual that is forced to do the given thing wouldn't have done that in the first place, and therefore his life quality is decreased. At the same time, the individual that gets to force him to do something else does get to benefit from that, given the very fact that he decides to force him, the other individual, to do that. There's something he's benefiting from. Now, there's also inefficiencies with the monopoly. If the government has a monopoly on a given industry and no one is able to compete in that given industry, well, the consumers don't have the choice. No matter how poor the product may be or service may be, well, what other options do they have? They're simply stuck with it. Overall, that was a pretty brief summary of Murray and Rothbard's Man, Economy, and the State. Of course, this is a very large book, and so I'm sure my summary did not do justice, and I did not cover every single topic possible because there would just be too much to cover. But I hope this gives you guys an introduction to economics and to his book. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to let me know. I'm going to have a few more coming out. I also read Mises's Human Action and possibly will do a video on that book, although there's a lot of carryover. So it depends what you guys like. Let me know, and I'd be happy to make some more videos. Keep learning.